Hey, Ben, it's Cole from Chicago, Illinois. I was actually wondering, both as an athlete, but also as a coach, I don't know if you've ever had COVID. I'm having it for the second time now. And I know the first time I had it, it really affected my engine capacity for a significant amount of time. And I feel like I've witnessed that in other athletes as well. How have you experienced your athletes or teammates having or getting over COVID? Do you think there's a way to follow a certain style of programming in order to accelerate getting your engine back, etc.? But thanks. Love the show. Love your programming. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Cole. So a quick disclaimer, I am not a medical professional. I'm not an MD, certainly not a COVID expert. However, what I am is a fitness coach. So that's sort of the lens I'm going to take for this. Basically, what are some guidelines or protocols to return to play after illness as a whole? So not necessarily exclusively COVID. However, let's get a little bit of a picture of what long COVID is. I've actually experienced this with a number of different clients who've had varying degrees of it. I mean, a lot of my clients have had COVID at this point, so I've gotten to see the effects, and quite a few people definitely have these lingering symptoms afterwards, whether it's just them taking a longer time to recover from COVID itself, or like what has technically become long COVID. So CDC defines long COVID as starting 4 weeks after COVID, right? Symptoms that are continuing to stick around after that point, which they have to draw a black and white line somewhere so they can make a diagnosis, sort of like, if you go to your doctor and you get a fasting blood work done and you have a glucose of 99, you're probably not going to hear anything because you're in range, right? But yet if you go one more point, if you're at 100, your doctor is going to be like, oh, that pinged basically, right? And that's sort of the cutoff, and now you're pre-diabetic, right? And you're given that label, that diagnosis. So that's sort of what's going on here, right? Whether it's the sort of the tail end of COVID or post-COVID symptoms, it's all sort of the same thing, right? It's how are we returning to play, and again, thinking about how we go about that process. How can we do that best? So that's sort of the lens I'm taking this through. So I would say, first of all, if you're still not feeling great, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to really throw down, put yourself into a hard Metcon, do some hard energy systems training, because all of that is just going to prolong that sickness. So in general, if I'm working with athletes and they're coming off a sickness of whatever it is, it's like, maybe we gave them 2 complete rest days. We did 2 more deload days, and they come to me and they're like, hey, I feel like I'm at 90% right now. I'm feeling pretty good. And I'm like, let's hold off one more day. That's sort of like my standard answer. It's like, let's hold off one more day. The reason being just like, I'd much rather see you the next day coming to be at 95 or 100% and feel really good and have a great training session, rather than being at 90%, getting a pretty good training session in that day, but the next day then being at 80% and just kind of feeling not great, and that lingering for maybe 2 or 3 more days than it would have if you just would have taken an extra rest day or recovery day before getting back into stressful training. Obviously, if something's a little bit more extensive, that process is going to be more of a buildup to get back to that point. So 3 principles that I think are going to be helpful. Again, this could be any illness. Certainly long COVID could play into this. And that's sort of what I'm sort of tailoring my answer to here. Principle 1 is movement is medicine. Training is stressful. So movement is an essential human need, right? If someone's wheelchair bound, frankly, they don't tend to live very long, unfortunately. Really practically, it's like if your diaphragm stops working, you suffocate. If your heart stops beating, you asphyxiate. You don't do well when you're not moving, right? So it's the same thing for humans. Like if we aren't moving, we don't tend to thrive. Likewise, if we move, even if we don't necessarily feel like moving, we typically do better. However, movement as an athlete often means training, and we need to disassociate those two things. They're not the same. Movement can be non-stressful, and in fact, it can be restorative in a lot of times, and that's certainly what you want to opt for most of the time when you're still recovering from whatever illness you're dealing with. So I would say you need to set aside time to just move, right? We're not talking about training here, so don't read into this. What I'm not saying is like you should go and start training even before you feel good. What I'm not saying is that, you need to ramp back up and really try to get into stressful training right away. And what I'm saying is you need to just move, right? Be a human, and that doesn't equal training, right? So we can do things that are restorative and helpful. And what might this movement look like? I would say it probably looks a lot like recovery day programming. So I know Cole's a pro member. He follows the protocol. So we have our Thursday recovery days that are sort of built out in that way. He could certainly go back and look at those. We have recovery day programming in the program vault, which he could certainly look at. We have like aerobic accessory type days. We have movement maintenance days. Things like that are going to be super helpful. But if I pull out some of maybe the themes that are in those things, what are good qualities of that? I would say number one is that we could be doing things that are like erg-based cyclical zone work. So it's not very hard. It's low eccentric components. It's just kind of getting you moving, getting some blood flow, getting some lymph flow. That's going to have restorative qualities. I could say this could be like just as simple as like foam rolling, like stretching and mobility work, stuff that's a little bit more passive and will still be good. Walking, right? Even if you're a competitive athlete and you have a pretty good base level of fitness, just going out and getting a walk in, even if you don't feel great, is going to be helpful. As you start feeling better, it could be easier bodyweight movements that have lower eccentric components, right? So this could be planks, it could be dead hangs, it could be farmer's carries or suitcase carries or things like that, right? Very little eccentric components. There's not going to be a lot of really powerful sort of taxing movement that's happening. And even if you're only doing like 15 minutes of that work, you're probably going to walk away from that feeling better, even if you're feeling subpar as a whole, than if you went and did stressful training and now you're actually at more of a recovery deficit and now you're having to build back. So that's the first principle. Principle number two, I would say, is to progress intensity conservatively. So 3 measures of intensity that you can kind of look at. Number 1 would be heart rate. Number 2 would be respiratory fatigue. And number 3 is your strength percentages. So first piece of advice would be to control your zones. So our energy systems classification zones, start at zone 1 or even zone 0, somewhere in that range. Keep it nasal, keep it like nose only breathing, keep it easy, right? If you feel good there after a couple of days, move it to zone 2. If you feel good there for a couple of days, then it's like, okay, maybe you can start to build in some easier interval work, like maybe EMOMs that are having some level of fatigue, but it's not like it's maximal exercise yet, right? It's not like 5 rounds per time. It's like spread out where it's like you get some break in between to make sure that the quality of that session stays high. So as you're feeling better, you can start to begin to build that accumulative fatigue. Again, one of the qualities there that I mentioned was to keep it nasal as long as possible. Really, anyone, even with very little training, should be able to keep it nasal through zone 0, zone 1. Zone 2, if you have any level of comfortability with nasal breathing, should still be a non-issue, especially if you're just like in an erg-based steady state environment. So definitely keep it nasal. Obviously, that can be an issue if you're someone who's dealing with a lot of congestion, but as a whole, I think you're probably not recovered if you're still dealing with a lot of nasal congestion either. So it probably makes sense to back that down and make it a little bit easier as well. So should be fairly easy to maintain that. One additional quality I would say is there shouldn't be any hyperventilation early on when you're still dealing with some of these symptoms, right? Like basically what's happening if you're hyperventilating is you did a bunch of tough work and now you're having to basically blow off carbon dioxide to be able to get to the point where you're balanced again and feel better. Obviously, if you're hyperventilating to basically, again, kind of catching your breath, so to speak, after you do a hard work bout, what's happening there is you're breathing really rapidly and really deeply. So obviously, if you're someone who's been dealing with some of the long symptoms of long COVID or COVID, that's not going to go super well. So just taking the time to back off on that intensity a little bit, where you're not, desaturating the muscle of oxygen and then having to basically blow off a bunch of CO2 because you've been doing a bunch of anaerobic work. If you don't have that acid buildup, that's probably putting you in a much better place in terms of immediately in that session, and then also the recovery deficit that you have afterwards will be less. Lastly, principle 3 would be to build back fundamental strength patterns. So if you're coming basically off a time of detraining if you've been sick, right? Imagine if you just didn't work out for 2 weeks, let alone if you got sick or had COVID and now you're coming back after that. So it's kind of like twofold. Like number 1, you weren't training. So even if you weren't training, even if you were doing nothing else, you're still going to have a dip in performance because of that. And then number 2, you were sick on top of that. So your body has all these recovery needs and you're probably not completely recovered still. So it's sort of a double whammy in that sense. So when I say building back, what I'm thinking about is sort of, threefold. It's sort of like the muscle itself. It's the connective tissue and just the joints being tolerant of those positions again, because often joint pain comes along with long COVID. And then 3, I would say it's also just like getting the nervous system to kind of kick back into gear, so to speak. So when we talk about fundamental strength patterns, the things that I would think about are basically, squat, hinge, push, pull, core, like midline work. So it's tempo back squats, it's RDLs, strict presses and pull-ups, it's hollow rocks, right? It's the fundamental, it's the basics, right? So going back to those things and then slowly building all of those qualities back up as you feel good. So as you're feeling good, you're gonna start to ramp those back up. No different than you're coming off like a period of detraining for something else or coming out of an off season, right? It's something gonna be very similar to that.